What do you guys think about Belarus kind of making these statements that they believe that they're about to be invaded from Poland or something like that?
It's cover for what the actual last ditch plan is, I think, on the Russian side, which is if Belarus was going to get hit at all, then if they really believed that there was going to be an incursion in Belarus, then I believe there's an operational plan already sitting on the Russian table to take all the Baltics in 2 days and hold them until they give up Ukraine. It's like you get the Baltics back for the Ukraine, end of story. Conventional invasion, take the Baltics completely off the map. That's what would happen if they put a foot into Belarus, in my opinion. The dinky little Chihuahua Baltics would all just be occupied because they are the exposed dick of NATO, sitting out there completely indefensible. You can't protect them from Belarus, Kaliningrad, and Russia all at once. It would be impossible. And I don't care how many even soldiers there are there. There's no strategic depth. You've got the Russian Navy in the Baltic Sea. You can't, there's just nothing there. The Baltics would fall in days, and then they would be hostages.
Would NATO not act on it?
NATO has nothing. If there's 5,000 troops there, that's just 5,000 American prisoners. Like, that's it. You can't stop it. Kaliningrad, Belarus, and St. Petersburg, like, they're surrounding you. You're done. It would be the 2-day invasion. And then they wouldn't hurt anybody. They would kill as few people as possible, and they would hand the Baltics neatly back to Europe in exchange for Ukraine. That's the last ditch. And that would be triggered by any attack on Belarus, which the Poles, being kind of stupid, might do.
Yes, I always thought that the taking the Baltic states into NATO as an alliance is always like a bad move. Like, it's a wrong move, militarily speaking.
Yep.
Because
Kissinger,
you trap yourself into a situation where, because they are already pretty anti-Russia, and then you take them in, and then they are weak. So they doesn't add to you. They only give you some space to put your missiles, and then they have a chance to cause you the war that you're trying to avoid.
Yeah, they're just your dick sitting out of your pants there, waiting to be cut off, and that's all they are.
And most of those Baltic countries, all they bring into the table is infantry. I mean, if you want to look, their armored forces are minuscule. Their armored vehicles minuscule. You know, a lot of them have armored cars, but most of the Baltics, all they're going to bring to the table is infantry, and they probably ain't got a lot of that either.
Infantry and belligerents.
Yeah, and I do want to say, I know there's some people in the comments talking about like anti-tank missiles and stuff, and I do know they have a longer range, and I'm just saying that if you're in an M1 and you got a clear shot, you can reach out and touch somebody, but the same can be said with the ATGM too. So I'm not saying it's invulnerable or you can shoot from way far away and not get touched. I mean, if I can see you, you can see me, and we can both shoot at each other.
So I was going back to the Baltics. I remember, last time, Command and Conquer, when you play the games, right, the missions, then they have the map come out, then they will have the icon, they appear, then they will explain the situation on the ground, then they will describe the army, how threatening are they. Then I remember, like, when we talk about Baltics, it reminds me of like the term laughable, the military level laughable.
But I mean, again, I'm playing devil's advocate like a lot, because I just want to ask all these questions from every perspective. Didn't Russia not move into Ukraine with the objective of killing as few people as possible?
Yes.
And we're stuck here 9 months later.
But Ukraine is much bigger, and it has strategic depth, and it's really hard to take a huge country like that quickly. And they thought there was a real chance for diplomacy if they just did a decapitation strike. They kind of hoped that Zelensky would take the ride and not the ammo, right? So, but the Baltics, they won't be under those illusions. These are little puppy countries that are belligerent, that are constantly trying to mess with them, and they need to end that finally and forever. And they would do that by not making any of those mistakes. They would go in hard. The governments of those countries would be dead. Anybody that had relatives, who had been Nazis would end up probably in a ditch. We would see quite a bit of people fleeing for where they're really from, which is Canada, the United States, and Britain, where a lot of the elite class of the Baltics grew up and only came back after the Soviet era. So they would just go in hard and, be brutal for once, and they would, by killing as few people as possible, I mean not random people, targeted people. There'd be a list of their long-standing political enemies. Why it is correct that taking the Baltics in was a disastrous mistake for NATO. George Kennan, Henry Kissinger, and several other old U.S. statesmen argued strongly against doing this in the 90s. And the unfortunate consequence of it is it enabled a group of people who really think that they can trigger some kind of massive destruction and dismantling of Russia. But that's such a geopolitical disaster in the world that the cost of it might be several thousand targeted killings in the Baltics just to prevent that from ever happening. And it's ruthless, but it saves all of North Asia from 100 years of civil war. Right?
Okay.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Speaking of like the breakup, though. Actually, Yvonne, go ahead. I'll go after you.
I was just to say real quick. I think the only way that those high risk operations would work, like going back at Kiev, is they would have to do what they should have done, which is just indiscriminately bomb Kiev with whatever they want, and just basically creep up online with tanks and just what they didn't do, where they'd have to have no regard for civilians and just say fuck it, let's go. Yeah. Then that stuff probably would have happened and they would have pulled it off. But I think they did go in with the intention of not killing civilians as a matter of policy, and they went in light, and we can see why we're here 9 months later. If they'd gone in hard like everyone thought they would, it probably would be over with, because even the NATO stuff wouldn't have had time to come into the theater to change anything or keep them propped up, especially if they had already lost Kiev, let's say, in a couple weeks, or the city was surrounded and destroyed, even if they hadn't captured it. I mean, it would have been a whole different story. And
but most of the anger about the war in Russia is that this wasn't done. That this wasn't done earlier. Right?